Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. My name is Catherine Tarka. I'm the Director of Literacy and Humanities at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon. I'm joined by Lisa Rice, Leandra Elian, and Holly Banashevitz from the Massachusetts Reading Association to co-lead this exciting event. We're glad to have you join us today to hear from our featured speaker, Margaret Goldberg, and to learn more about the research and evidence-based practices featured in the Mass Literacy Guide. Here's a look at our webinar agenda. We'll start with an introduction to the Mass Literacy Guide and the partnership between the Massachusetts Reading Association and DESE. Most of our time today will be spent hearing from our featured speaker, Margaret Goldberg, and after Margaret speaks, we'll have some time for questions, moderated by leaders of the MRA, followed by some announcements and upcoming opportunities before we close out. As you know, this webinar is being recorded. Today's recording will be publicly posted on the Mass Literacy site within about a week of today's event. To find the recording, look under Mass Literacy Top Resources to find this, as well as all of our previous webinar recordings. A page with all of the links referenced in today's presentation is being dropped in the chat for you. Click chat to see the link to what we call our link sheet. You can reference this link sheet for any links or resources that are mentioned today so you don't have to rush to write things down or worry about losing track of links. The link sheet includes the top resources page, which I just mentioned. If you have a question during today's presentation, please use the Q&A feature. Some of my colleagues will be monitoring the Q&A and we will get to as many of your questions as we can. To get started, let's talk a bit about mass literacy, an initiative that many folks here today on the webinar are already familiar with. Mass literacy is a statewide effort to empower educators with the evidence-based practices for literacy that all students need. Here in DESE's Office of Literacy and Humanities, we base everything we do on the belief that evidence-based instruction provided within schools and classrooms that are culturally responsive and sustaining will put our youngest students here in Massachusetts on the path towards literacy for life. You're looking right now at the Mass Literacy Guide homepage, which launched last October. So happy first birthday to the Mass Literacy Guide. The Mass Literacy Guide is an interactive site that includes tons of research, information, and resources to empower educators with evidence-based practices for early literacy. The development of the Mass Literacy Guide involved over 100 stakeholders from across the state, as well as national and international experts, folks passionate about early literacy instruction and student learning. A major partner in this work was the Massachusetts Reading Association. The department is proud to partner with MRA again today to bring you this special webinar in support of our shared belief that all of our students can learn to read and write well when provided with evidence-based and culturally responsive instruction. Within the Mass Literacy Guide, you'll find a wealth of information regarding literacy teaching and learning. If you haven't checked it out, I hope you'll check it out after today's webinar. You'll find sections that speak to equity, complex text, fluent word reading, language comprehension, students experiencing reading difficulties, and so many more topics related to early literacy. In a few minutes, Margaret Goldberg will speak to some of these evidence-based practices and how they're built into instructional materials that teachers use every day. As you're listening to Margaret today and thinking about the instructional materials for literacy that are available in your school, please take a moment to also check out the Curate Project. The Curate Project from DESE provides reviews of published curricular materials and resources to help Massachusetts educators identify and use high-quality curricular materials. You'll find a link to the Curate reviews on the link sheet that was dropped in the chat. Now I'd like to welcome two of my MRA colleagues to the mic, Leandra Elian and Lisa Rice, to share a little bit about our partnership between MRA and DESE.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Well, needless to say, all of us on this webinar spend our days and our afternoons and evenings and nights and weekends thinking and working, thinking about literacy. So for a group of us on the MRA board, we were so thrilled and of course so honored when DESE approached us to give them some guidance and some feedback on their mass literacy initiative. So even though we knew it would involve a lot of work, and it did, and a lot of meetings, and it did, we jumped at that chance to look at the entire process of literacy learning. It was wonderful to be able to sort of take a step back from our individual lessons or the books that we were reading, the books we had in front of us, and just to focus on strategies and practices across the stages and the grades. And then as we reviewed all those documents and the drafts, we looked for solid evidence of proven practices, exactly as Catherine said, as well as the practicality of those guidance documents for teachers. Our feedback and our suggestions were noted and incorporated for the most part. Yes, I should pretty much say we had this wonderful relationship of them, sharing ideas and feedback. And this partnership also emphasized for us personally and professionally how the expertise and knowledge of teachers can be used to help other teachers and literacy leaders. And that's why we're so pleased to have Margaret Goldberg with us today, who is a practicing classroom teacher. So we are pleased to continue our joint efforts to support evidence-based early literacy by co-hosting this webinar. And we're pleased not only for our practice, but for how it will impact our students. So I'm going to hand it over to Lisa now to tell you a little bit more about the MRA's work.
Thank you very much. So I am Lisa Rice. I wanted to just tell you for about a minute about my journey through with MRA. I started with MRA about 7 years ago. I'm hoping by telling my story, it will inspire you to want to learn more about our organization and find your passion through our work. 7 years ago, I started as the president for the Central Mass Reading Council, and I wanted to get involved because I wanted to bring high quality professional development to our area in Central Massachusetts. And one of the shining moments of that work was that we did a workshop with Jennifer Saravello. So it's really exciting to get involved and to see your passion projects come to life with your work through the MRA. From there, I then joined on as the treasurer. And I will say professionally and personally, I have grown from my experience with the MRA. Sometimes our work can be lonely. We might be the only literacy person, support person in our building or even in our district. And to be able to have this community of people who share the same vision and the same passion is just a wonderful experience. I always know that I can send a quick email if I'm trying to work something out or I need an area of expertise or some help. There's always someone in MRA who is able and willing to help. And who would have thought 7 years ago when I started, I would be here talking to you on a Department of Ed, the leading educational resource that we have here in Massachusetts. So I encourage all of you to give us a look, if you haven't already, the Massachusetts Reading Association. We have some great events coming up in December and in February that we will talk about at the end of this presentation. So thank you very much. And back to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Leandra. And now on to the main event. We're so pleased to have Margaret Goldberg here today to share about her journey towards evidence-based practice. Margaret currently serves as an elementary literacy coach in a large urban district in California and was until recently a grade 1 classroom teacher. Margaret is a co-founder of the Right to Read Project, which is a group of teachers, researchers, and activists committed to the pursuit of equity through literacy. Her writing is also published on the Right to Read Project blog and on Reading Rockets. She's done work as a curriculum developer and she presents nationally. She has so much to share with us today. We truly appreciate her time and expertise coming to Massachusetts. Welcome, Margaret. And I will invite you to share your screen now and go ahead.
Thanks so much, Catherine. So it's great to be with you guys. I'm on California time right now, so it is lunch at my school. We're going to talk today about the things I've tried over the course of my professional career when it comes to teaching reading. We're first gonna set the stage. I'll let you know about the context in which I was working. I'm gonna share with you a lesson example of unsystematic instruction. I'll share with you a lesson example of systematic instruction that I provided. And then really try to dive into the instructional implications that are a result of this varying type of instruction. We're going to have some time at the end to reflect and to question. So as questions are arriving in your mind, please don't hesitate to share them. Here is the data from the school that I was working at in 2015. This was the first year of my journey into evidence-based reading instruction. So I was working at a school where 97% of students received free and reduced lunch, and our students were 27% African-American, 49% English language learner, 64% Latino. I was supposed to be focusing on grade 1 reading intervention and on coaching, and this was the incoming first grade data. These kiddos had kindergarten leveled reading, and what was interesting to me about the outcome of that instruction was that 87% of them were in need of intervention, 59% in need of urgent intervention, and 28% in need of strategic intervention. We had just about 13% of kids who were coming out of kindergarten with the skills they needed to be successful in first grade. So the first example that I'm going to share with you is a lesson that came from the district adopted program I was given to teach reading intervention. It's a common curriculum found in many schools, might be in yours. What's most important about it, though, isn't the program. It's that it's representative of a common approach to teaching reading. It's something that we see in classrooms everywhere. So this particular lesson is lesson 27 in the program. Prior to this, I had taught 26 first grade reading intervention lessons. What I knew about the students who are in this intervention came from our curriculum embedded assessment, so from their reading records. I had groups of 3 students, and what I knew about them was their degree of accuracy. So Alexa was reading level B books with 98% accuracy, and she was focusing on meaning and structure. Angel had slightly less in the way of accuracy, and his focus was on the meaning of text. And Kylie was reading with 90% accuracy, focusing on the meaning and structure of the books. What I realized, and what you'll see as I start walking through this lesson example, is that my students were not paying attention to what the curriculum would have called the visual part of reading. They weren't attending to the letters on the page and the words on the page. But this lesson was intended to teach phonics. The phonics principle introduced in it was CBC, so short vowel words. And then there were some high frequency words that were introduced in this lesson and reviewed: have, our, on, and some. So we're going to start diving into this lesson designed to target CBC phonics. The first step of the lesson was a warm-up. So students would reread predictable books given to them in previous lessons. And the program had me prompt them for self-monitoring. If they made an error while reading, I was supposed to prompt them to try that again. Think about what would make sense. Then I was supposed to pull out some L. Conan boxes and do some word work with students. Then introduce a new story, give students the opportunity to read that story and then discuss and revisit the text. And then if there was time left over, there were additional activities for me to do with students, letter word work. But to be totally honest, these intervention lessons were supposed to fit in like 20 minutes and it was always super tight. We would run over even if I didn't get into that additional optional activity. But my lessons always started with the warm-up where students would come into the room and reread the books that I had given them. What I noticed during this time is that while I called it reading practice, like come in and read your books, what students were actually doing was reciting books. And if I urged them to, they would point to the words in them, but they weren't actually attending to the letters and words on the page. After they got a chance to reread predictable books, then we got into the phonics or word work section. So for this particular lesson, I had L. Conan boxes. And I had students say the word get sound the word get, and then tell me what letters I should write in to represent the g, e, and t sounds in the word get. I had some more examples of short vowel words to work on with the students. And then the last few examples in the lesson were words like side, where I'd have the students sound out side, tell me the S, the I, and the D to represent the sounds that they heard in the word. And then I was prompted to tell them, I'm going to add an E to the end of the word to make it look right. And there were a couple of other long vowel examples like that, where they would record L, I, and K for like, and I would tell them you need an E at the end to make the word look right. And this explanation, it didn't sit right with me, but I wasn't exactly sure how to explain it otherwise. So I just did the word work as it was written into the program. But if I stop to think about what did students learn about the logic of long vowels, or even of short vowels, it was that things need to look right in English. Meaning you actually have to have seen the word before, probably seen it a bunch of times in order to know how to spell it. The focus was on the letters rather than on the sounds in the words. After doing some word work, my next step was to introduce a story. So I would always try to get some excitement going, build enthusiasm about the book. I would read the title aloud and show them the cover and start asking some questions to stimulate their own background knowledge. So for this book, it was, have you ever had a waffle to eat? What are some things you can put on top of a waffle? And then tell students, this book is about some yummy things you can have on top of waffles. We'd look at the cover of the book, our waffles, and then I would do a picture walk with students. So we would look at the first page and I would say, what does the waffle have on it? They'd be like syrup. And then I would point out that the words say, let's have syrup on our waffles. So I would actually read this page aloud, pointing to the words, telling students what the words in the text were. On the next page, I would ask again, what does the waffle have on it? They'd tell me butter. And then I'd focus on the high frequency word intended with this lesson, which was have. And I'd say, what letter do you see in have? They'd say H. And I would have students locate the word have on the page and put their finger underneath it. And they were to tell me that word was have. Then I'd turn the page, we'd get excited about the strawberries in the book, and then I'd try to focus their attention onto the high frequency word some that was the target in this lesson. And here's where things started to go a little bit wrong. I would say, what letter would you first see in some? They'd say S, and then I'd have them locate the word some, and invariably I had students put their finger underneath the word strawberries. And when this happened, I wasn't sure how to correct them. I could tell them this is some, or I could reread the page to them and have them hear the word some and then put their finger on top of it. But I didn't feel like I had the supports on hand to be able to explain to them based on the phonics they knew why the one word was some and one was strawberries. At the end of this picture walk and going through the words in the text, I actually hadn't left that much reading for my students to do. I had basically told them the whole book prior to them reading it. And when I think about what this taught them about reading a new book, it was that they needed to have an adult teach them the book before they could read it, which is the complete backwards attitude towards reading we want students to have, right? We want them to learn that in order to find out what's inside of a book, you take it off the shelf and you open it up and you read the words that are in there. But this practice that I was doing in my instruction was school-wide, was creating a belief in our students that they could not read books they hadn't encountered with an adult before. And I remember actually sitting with a second grade student during reader's workshop time. She wasn't reading. And I was like, please grab a book from your book bin. Which book do you want to read to me? And she pulled a book out and she was like, I can't read this book. I don't know it. And I realized that by front loading the book so much, we were actually doing a disservice to our students and their feelings of confidence in being able to tackle new texts. But after all that front loading, I had my students read the story. So they'd flip back to the beginning and they'd read to find out about the things a waffle can have on it and what would happen at the end of the book. So I heard students reciting the text, let's have some, and they'd look at the picture, blueberries on our waffles. Let's have some, look at the picture, bananas on our waffles. And at this point in the lesson, I asked a student, how did you know that word was bananas? And his answer was, because bananas are long. And he pointed underneath this word and showed me the length of the word bananas. And my gut was telling me something's off with this instruction that I'm doing, but I still wasn't sure how to fix it. So I had my students finish the book. After reading that text, my students didn't actually learn any new vocabulary or concepts because the whole premise of a predictable book is that they're on familiar topics. The students were able to tell me all about waffles before we ever started reading it. At the end of this lesson, there was an opportunity to be able to do some word work, but I rarely got to those opportunities. So let's take a look at what I would actually have done. The rereading of predictable books, prompting to think about what word would make sense in that context. Some Elkonin boxes to introduce, and then it turned out it was short vowels and long vowels in there. And then the reading of a story. And in hindsight now, when I look at the lesson plan, what I see isn't systematic or explicit instruction. And I now actually describe what I was doing as committing random acts of literacy. I was doing a whole lot of reading related activities, but they weren't connected to one another. So let's take a look at what I mean by that. If we look at the text from our waffles and think about the principle of the lesson, which was using CBC patterns, I'll pause for a moment and let you count how many CBC words do you see in this text? Yeah, you probably realized there were actually 0 opportunities for students to apply the phonics they were learning to reading. And it had actually been 8 lessons since the last time CBC words had been a focus. In this lesson, I introduced a new phonics concept with words like and side when we were doing the Elkonin boxes. But if you look for opportunities for them to apply that concept to their reading, there's still 0. And then I wouldn't get into the concept of final E for another 14 lessons anyway. So it was like I had dropped a little bit of knowledge on them. Maybe they picked it up, maybe they didn't. And then I moved on and didn't cycle back to that content for another 14 lessons. A lot of times we think about predictable books as being helpful for teaching high frequency words. So in this lesson, we had have, our, and then some ones I had introduced before, on, and some. I'll give you a moment to take a look and see how many times those popped up. You may have counted about 5 times in the text. And then if I had gotten to that optional word work, there might have been a little extra practice with our. But here's the thing. When students were reading this text, they were reciting the words that I had told them were already in the book. They weren't actually paying attention to the words have and some. They weren't looking closely at those words. And even if they had been looking closely at those words, even if they had gotten 4 to 5 practice rounds with them, it was going to be a very long time until they saw have again. So what you'll see is the scope and sequence for the program that I was teaching, lessons 1 through 26 across the top, and then the high frequency words that appeared in the text. And what you'll notice is big chunks of time would go by before that high frequency word was ever revisited. When I looked at the scope and sequence laid out like this, what I realized was that there were real gaps in the program, and they were completely in line with the gaps of my students' knowledge. So this quote comes from Dr. Moats. She said, "Leveled books cannot be the basis for systematic, explicit approach to beginning reading instruction. With each advancing level, students encounter many untaught phonic patterns and words. Lacking the tools to decode the books, students become ever more reliant on memorization and guesswork, unless they are lucky enough to intuit the print code from exposure or incidental teaching. So the next example that we're going to look at comes from a program that was dusty on the shelves of my school. I pulled the boxes out because I realized my students weren't actually attending to the letters on the page as they were reading. I noticed all of these gaps in their knowledge, and I felt like I needed to try something else. So this comes from a different program, another first grade reading intervention program, also super common. But what we'll be talking about is the features of this program, how it was systematic, sequential, and it provided explicit instruction that had cumulative practice for students. And for this lesson example, I'm going to show you a lesson that was further on into the program. So my students had 60 lessons before we got into this. The goal for this lesson was introducing the final E spelling pattern. It was their first introduction to long vowels. And then we also were working on high frequency words, large, every, and after. What I knew about my students for this program came from a curriculum embedded assessment that focused on phonics. So it focused on specific spelling sound patterns. And then I was collecting data to determine whether or not my students were able to apply what had been taught to reading words with those spelling patterns. So what I knew about my students was quite a bit more detailed information. I knew exactly how many decodable words with the phonics patterns I had taught in the last batch of lessons students had mastered. And I also knew exactly which high frequency words I had taught that they needed more review with and which they had mastered. So let's take a look at the lesson steps. The lesson always started with phonological awareness. In this case, it was an emphasis on final sound. Then I would get into phonics and reading decodable words. Then there was a piece on high frequency words. And then the last chunk of the lesson was an application portion of the lesson, where I would give students words during dictation and where they would read connected text, applying the concepts previously taught earlier in the lesson. So for the phonological awareness routine, in this program, rather than in Conan boxes, it had a similar strategy, these sound lines here. And I would have students say a word like side, tell me the sounds inside, I'd, and then for this lesson, emphasis on final sound, I would say, what's the last sound? And they would say d. I'd say take, sound take, t, a, k, last sound, k. We would do it with other words like mode, for example. And what you probably noticed about those example words is that they all had long vowels in them. I, side, take, and mode. Then we jump into the phonics portion of the lesson and refer back to previously taught concepts. So my students had mastered reading with short vowels. I would have them read the word mad and then explain to them that when an E is added to the end of the word, the vowel has a long sound, A, and this word is made. They would read pet, and I would show them that an E added to the end of the word gave this E the long vowel sound E, and we'd read Pete. We'd keep working with some contrasting pairs until they understood that the E at the end of a word might indicate a long vowel sound. Then I'd show them the wall cards posted up in my classroom so that they were able to see, oh, for each one of these, we've got a mnemonic like make cake and the spelling pattern A consonant E to represent the long A sound. Then I had handheld cards. So these spelling patterns were on handheld cards. Students would practice making each one of the sounds, A, E, I, O, U, and U. And then I mixed those cards in with previously taught sounds like the short vowels and then some of the digraphs that my students were still working on. And then we do cumulative practice with all of the sounds that we needed to review. After this, I gave my students a decodable word list. And so they would think and then read each one of the words on this list. And you'll notice that this list has words with the final E, long vowel spelling pattern, and also short vowel words to make sure that students aren't overcorrecting by providing a whole lot of long vowel sounds without attending to what's actually there in the word. What was really important about this instruction is that if my students could read these words with no context around them, there were no sentences that went with them, no pictures, they were just reading these words in isolation, that actually meant that they could read these words in any context, in any book in which the word cure pops up. So when it comes to what they learned about the logic of long vowels, they learned that the E at the end of a word matters and that they need to attend to that. And then we would get into the section on sight words or high frequency words. And the topic of sight words is actually one that's got a lot of buzz around it right now. We're going to take a look at a quote that comes from the Mass Literacy Guide to help explain. Many high frequency words are grammatical glue necessary to form and read sentences, such as do, does, were, are, was, of. A majority of high frequency words are regular or have just one irregular letter sound pattern. Whether high frequency words are regular or irregular, they should be taught associated with their spelling, sounds, and meaning, and not memorized as a single unit by sight. So this is a really important explanation of effective and ineffective practice when it comes to sight words. It's really important that we don't think of sight words as something that is memorized as like a visual JPEG, for example. We don't want to teach these words as wholes on flashcards where the kids just glance at it and say the word. What we want them to do is to attend to the letters that are in those words, noticing the order of those letters, connecting the letters to the pronunciation of the word, and then to the meaning of the word. So for introducing high frequency words with this program, I read a sentence aloud. He drives a large truck, and let them know that large would be one of the high frequency words we would practice. I would do the same thing with every. And now these words were intentionally chosen. So my students hadn't yet learned the soft sound J in the word large. They didn't know G followed by an I, E, or Y has the J sound. And so for this, in order to be able to read the word large in connected text, they actually needed to attend to the spelling of the word, L-A-R-G-E, large. We would do the same thing with every. They would read and spell the word. And then I had handheld cards with these words that I could mix in with previously taught high frequency words. And we could read, spell, read each one of these words. So students would say there, T-H-E-I-R, there. Live and live, L-I-V-E, live and live. And we'd work our way through that cumulative practice. After that, we got into dictation. This was always my students' favorite part. So with dictation, they had a sheet of paper on which they would write a word that I said. So for example, I would say note, say note, sound note, and students go, note. And I'd say question, and they'd say, which O should we use to write note? So they're thinking through, is it the O blank E spelling pattern in the word note? Is it the O, is it going to be the OA spelling pattern or OW? So I would reference the wall card for the long O spelling pattern and support them in writing the word note. We would do that with some more word practice, like ride, mute, and tap, and then get into some high frequency word practice so they could read and spell those words, and then also write a sentence using both long and short vowels. After doing some guided spelling, then we would get into our story for the lesson. So I would tell students about the story, like we have 2 chapters about birds that can't fly. Today we'll read about emperor penguins. They live on ice and in the sea. The mother penguin lays an egg and puts it on the father's feet. The father keeps the egg warm under a flap of skin until the baby hatches. Then there were some extensions that I could do with that introduction, like if I had a map on hand. What you'll notice is that I was building students' background knowledge in order to help them be successful with the text, but I wasn't actually referencing any of the words in the text, telling them what it said prior to them reading it. I could actually just give them this decodable text. They had it in a much cuter looking book, but I could just give them the text, penguins, and they could read it, applying the phonics that I had taught them. And if they got to a tricky word like dive and I heard div, I could prompt them. Is there an E at the end of the word? Long or short? And they'd say long. Sound for I read the word, dive. And I was able to give them prompting that allowed them to notice what was important about the words that were in their text. So when it comes down to the amount of reading that I left for my students to do, it was basically all of it. I was building their confidence and competence in being able to read because I could give them something and know that they could be successful with it with limited scaffolding from me. Also, because students were able to sound out unfamiliar words, they could come along new vocabulary and concepts while they were reading. We weren't reliant on them already having a huge amount of information about waffles, for example, prior to reading. I didn't need to depend on them having a huge amount of information about the bird in this story. Let's take a look at the phonics that was in this lesson, in this story. So I introduced large and every. And then there were also some high frequency words that were reviewed in this lesson. And when we look at the amount of practice that students got, it is a huge amount over and over again in the text here. This also comes from the Mass Literacy Guide. It's an explanation of the kinds of texts that are most beneficial, these decodable texts for beginning readers. Decodable texts are most beneficial when children are early in their development of phonics knowledge. This timing varies for individual children. When students are learning basic phonics patterns, including those typically taught in kindergarten and first grade, decodable texts support applied practice. So the way that I think about this is that decodable text actually gives students a purpose for the phonics or word work that appears earlier in the lesson. Students understand that they're learning foundational skills for the purposes of reading, and then with our dictation for the purposes of writing. What I think is really important for us to realize is that if we want students to have the opportunity to apply phonics and to see its relevance, we need to make sure that we're giving them texts that confirm the phonics that they've been practicing. So let's take a look at penguins. In this lesson, the focus was on final E spelling pattern. I'll pause for a moment and let you look for the number of final E words. Skim and scan this text. You're probably finding a whole lot of examples of it. Probably didn't count all the way to 27, but there were 27 opportunities for students to read with a final E spelling pattern. Words like slide and cute are all over the text. Words like 8 and mile, so that they really get practice applying the phonics that I had taught them. Another thing that's super important is that this spelling pattern, final E, was in every subsequent lesson after this one. And there was progress monitoring embedded into the program, so that I would assess my students on their ability to read final E words after a couple of lessons, after 4. So by the end of the week, I would get some really good information on whether or not my students were able to sound out words with final E. This idea of cumulative practice is super duper important for decodable words. So when we're thinking about students applying their phonics knowledge of final E to text, it's really important that the text that they're applying it to also reviews things like the short vowels that had been previously taught, so that students are able to encounter a word like not and know why it's not, and not note, for example. Cumulative practice is also really important for those high frequency words that I was talking about previously. So I'm going to show you something about the scope and sequence of this program that I was using. You'll see across the top the lessons in order of which I taught. Then you'll see the sight words that appeared in the lesson. And you'll see that every single time a sight word appeared in the lesson, it was reviewed in every subsequent lesson. In that cumulative review handheld card deck that I had in the lesson, in the decodable text that students were being given to read, in the guided spelling that students were doing. So I could be really positive that there were no gaps in student knowledge when it came to these concepts. Let's take a look at this and compare it to the other program that I was talking to you about. When we look at the visual impact of cumulative practice, we're able to see no wonder why students are much more confident, capable, enthusiastic about their reading when they get these indicators of success over and over again in cumulative practice in a lesson, these small little victories of new words that we've learned. That's a really stark contrast to when students feel like they're forgetting things in between lessons because we're not providing that cumulative practice. I actually got super curious and I did a little informal assessment of students in these two different programs. And I was just checking to see how they did with their retention of sight words. And what I noticed is that my students who are using predictable books to read and who are in my leveled reading groups, they actually only retained a small fraction of the words that I had taught. A good portion of words were falling in through those cracks. For my students who are in the other program, who are receiving systematic instruction, they were reliably learning 80% of the content that I taught, and the 20% that they might have still been a little shaky on would be reviewed in the next set of lessons. So we were always building towards mastery. So here's another quote that comes from the Massachusetts Curriculum Framework. Students should receive explicit instruction in skills, including phonics and decoding. Explicit skill instruction is especially important in narrowing opportunity gaps. So when we think about the instruction that we're providing, we need to be absolutely certain that our expectation is mastery of foundational skills, and that students for whom mastering those skills, it's more difficult. So for kids who need more time and support and repetition and cumulative practice and encouragement, they get the dosage that's necessary for them to be able to master those skills. And for students who need less in the way of explicit instruction, they can go along with a smaller dosage of that instruction. They can progress on the scope and sequence for phonics much more quickly. And what will end up happening is that all students by the end of the primary grades will emerge as automatic readers. Students who are able to decode the words on the page effortlessly, so that they can then divert their attention to focusing on the meaning of the text when they're in grades late second grade, third grade, and above. So when we think about this need to narrow the opportunity gap, need to ensure that all students leave the primary grades able to read the words on the page so that they're able to get into grade level text, let's think about the students with whom I was working. So in fall of first grade, the at benchmark students, it was only 8% of kids. On watch, we had just 5% of our kiddos. In need of intervention, that was the bulk of students. We had 28% of students in need of strategic intervention and 59% in need of urgent intervention. When I was providing leveled reading instruction, I was doing such a light touch on their areas of weakness. I wasn't providing a lot of explicit instruction and practice in phonics. So what was happening was that I wasn't going to be able to close the gap with that instruction. The students who had been relegated to the lower level text, levels A, B, C, and D into first grade, were going to continue making slow progress. while the students who began first grade reading at a higher level, they were going to be able to read more text and learn more words and learn more from their reading. And this gap was actually going to become increasingly wide. Luckily, I abandoned that approach to instruction when I started realizing that the systematic approach was a whole lot more effective. So what happened by the end of the year was astounding. What I was able to see was that in spring, we had flipped our pyramid. Our at and above benchmark percentage became 63%. So the majority of students were reading at grade level. We had a portion of students who were still on watch, but they were on that verge right there. And then our intervention needs had gotten cut down to a reasonable load for second grade to be able to take on their work. Now, I just want to speak for a moment. Our data could have actually been higher had we not spent the early months of school trying to figure out what to do in terms of instruction. So what happened for me as a reading interventionist is I was piloting 2 programs at the same time, seeing one was much more effective than the other, and then having conversations with the teachers at first grade in which they were saying, you know, the ones that you're seeing for a more code-based approach, they're the only ones who are making gains. And we all, as a team, decided to change our approach and to focus on providing systematic, explicit instruction to all of our students to ensure we had closed the gap. So taking a look at these graphs side by side is pretty impactful when we think of the load that second grade had been spared because of our shift in instruction. So just to recap, in the leveled reading approach, what happened was I had included phonics instruction. There was some attention to phonemic awareness, but the materials that I was using, they were based on the belief that reading is a visual process. These were materials that were grounded in the 3 cueing or MSV approach to teaching reading. That really misunderstands the role of phonological awareness in reading. It minimizes the importance of students hearing the sounds and words and learning the letters that represent them. It also misunderstands the role of context in skilled reading, right? It's having students use context instead of decoding in order to say the words in the text. It included a book introduction, which misunderstands the role of meaning in skilled reading. You shouldn't have to understand a book in order to be able to read it. You should get your understanding from the book. Readers compensate for a lack of systematic phonics instruction in this approach by guessing at words. And it becomes a process in which students have to memorize a whole lot of words and a whole lot of books and sentences because they're getting minimal teacher prompting that will help them learn how to sound out words. And we can compare that with the second lesson example, which was a structured phonics lesson. In this lesson, students received explicit phonics and phonemic awareness instruction, and all of those skills were taught for the purpose of reading. There was a clear scope and sequence, and students got the opportunity to apply the skills to connected text into their writing. Readers in this approach get to an unfamiliar word and they sound it out, a strategy that's going to work for them throughout the grades, unlike the picture supports that would have fallen away. And this promotes the orthographic mapping, which is a very fancy way of saying automatic word recognition. This allows students to become efficient and independent and confident in their reading. So to close out, I just want to give you a few quick tips that I learned for what to look for in curriculum. One is to make sure that there's an evidence-based explanation for how skilled reading develops. If your materials present you with the MSV or 3 cueing model of teaching of reading, you're going to want to put those down and pick up a program that is instead providing an explanation of how the sounds in our spoken language are represented by the letters in our alphabet. That means there has to be a super clear scope and sequence for instruction for phonological awareness and phonics that goes from simpler concepts to more complex ones and allows students to read and write using those concepts. It also needs to have progress monitoring. Foundational skills need to be taught to mastery. So it's essential that you're getting frequent data coming in, letting you know whether or not students have mastered the concepts and are ready for more, or if students are in need of additional reteaching before you move on. So that brings us probably to a good point to be able to talk about some questions that you may have about instruction, whether it's about ongoing review and cumulative practice or the actual instruction of teaching reading. I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Margaret. I particularly enjoyed where you said decodable text gives students a purpose for the phonics work. That was a great quote that I took away. We have some questions that we're going to ask. The first one is something I'm sure everyone is feeling on this call, including yourself, who is a current practitioner. Sometimes it can feel overwhelming to manage all the necessary parts of the lesson. You had given us a good lesson structure. Do you have any suggestions to support teachers? Like, how do you get through all that in your lesson?
Really great question. So the second lesson example that I gave you is a 30-minute lesson. So for every lesson, I would begin with a phonological awareness activity that takes no more than a minute. After that, it's introducing the spelling patterns that are represented in that lesson. So according to the scope and sequence, again, direct, explicit instruction with clear, concise directions means that it doesn't take more than a minute or two to introduce those concepts. Then we've got a couple of minutes for cumulative practice, where they're applying that to reading decodable words, where we're doing some work with high frequency words. And then the bulk of the lesson is spent getting into the text. So at least half of the lesson would be devoted to reading decodable text and to writing words with the phonics that they've been taught. So I think one of the ways that it has worked for me to think about this instruction is you're going as fast as you can and as slow as you must, which is a quote from Dr. Anita Archer, which I love.
That's excellent. Excellent. All right. I've got another question. We have a question from someone working in a third grade classroom about scaffolding. Some of her students are reading and writing at a grade 1 level. Is there anything in particular that you would suggest that that practitioner could do to support these students?
Absolutely. So I would make sure to give them a quick phonics survey. So there's all sorts of them that are available. And what you're trying to do is figure out what spelling patterns do they know and what spelling patterns do they need to learn. And then look to the program materials that you have to be able to find where in the scope and sequence of this program do my students need to begin their instruction. One thing that I think is really helpful is to think of yourself not as an island, your own kids with all of their different needs, but to think of yourself as part of a team. So for example, at my school, grades 1 and 2 share students for foundational skills instruction, 3 and 4, 5 and 6. And that allows us to provide differentiated instruction at the point of need for students without having to teach 15 different small groups within our own class.
That's a great tip to be efficient. Excellent. I think Leandra now has a question.
Yes, I have a couple of questions, and I also just want to say that sort of from the questions and the chat and from listening to you, I think everybody appreciates how you give voice, you articulate all these difficult teaching dilemmas that we all face, and that you sort of gave voice to them and you give us how you work through them. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that people wanted to know. For instance, so how, when you're teaching spelling, you gave us some examples of, you spelled the word L-A-R-G-E orally. What else do you do to reinforce the spelling of a word?
Great question. So for high frequency words like large, if my students hadn't yet been taught the soft J sound in that word, they have what we call a sight word dictionary, where any previously taught high frequency words live. And anytime they're writing throughout the day, if they need to spell the word large, they know they can look under L in their dictionary and pull that word out. But generally, that is not the way I want students to approach the writing. Generally, what I want them to do is to say the word that they need to write, and to sound that word out. So if the word is notes, that they would go notes. and then to use the tool in the classroom, which is the sound spelling cards, and to write the letters that represent the sounds that they heard in that word. And that's actually going to be the best approach for them to be able to write unfamiliar words in any content area that's popping up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so another question that was also quite specific about one of these teaching dilemmas that teachers have is how do you handle like exceptions to the rule when you're teaching spelling and reading?
Great question. So that's why it's so important to have high quality evidence-based materials that have a good scope and sequence, because we actually want to minimize students' exposure to exceptions. Anytime they are encountering exceptions, we have to acknowledge that the phonics that we have taught them was not sufficient to be able to tackle that word. And so that can actually undermine our phonics instruction. What we want is high quality evidence-based materials with a scope and sequence that allows students to maximize their practice with the words that are connected to the phonics that we're teaching. Yeah. But it's going to happen in a great read aloud that we're doing, or just as we're walking through the school, that they're going to find words that don't match the phonics that they've already been taught. In which case, I always just explain it as, oh, that's a sight word because you haven't learned to sound it out yet, and then tell the student the word.
Great, thank you. Lisa, do you have another question?
I do just want to share here. People are saying that they very much are enjoying this. They are thrilled with everything that you're sharing. They love everything that you're sharing with them. So thank you. We had, we're coming off of COVID with technology. So we do have a question regarding technology right now. Are there any new emerging apps or tech that you might be excited about that you want to share with us?
That's a great question. So full disclosure, I was super anti-technology until I taught first grade via Zoom all year last year. And then my attitude shifted. Here's what I learned. I learned that anything that students are doing when it comes to apps, I actually need to gather good data from. So if it doesn't give me a good report that lets me know how students are managing the content that they're seeing, that's something that I want to stay away from. I think probably what I can say in terms of that is that anything that you can do to, I guess, target the practice that they're getting is a good sign. So if you're able to pick the high frequency words or phonics that are going to appear in the activities students are doing in these apps, then it's probably a much better supportive program than if it's just generating these things randomly. So no, I'm not recommending anything by name, but I can tell you kind of what to look for.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, exactly on that topic, and I think this might be our last question that we have time for today, is, we know how important the right data is. So when you are picking a screener, or you have a screener in front of you, what is the most useful thing that a screener should have? What are you looking for a screener to tell you?
Great question. So I only use screeners that provide information that is valid, predictive, reliable. So that means that I will actually go and check to make sure that it's been well reviewed. I think it's RTI for Success. They may have rebranded, but they've got a spreadsheet that will tell you the validity of screening tools. So I only use screeners that pop up really well on those, I don't know what you want to call it, but like agnostic reviews. Then when I'm looking at screening data, what it's telling me is how students are doing generally with their fluency of these foundational skills. And so that's going to allow me to sort students in our school, for example, according to area of need. So we have students in need of urgent intervention, systematic, strategic intervention, kids who are at benchmark, and kids who are soaring. I use that data in order to determine the resources that we have and to whom they're devoted. So the number of minutes of intervention is determined at my school by our DIBELS scores. When it comes down to like what I need to know about my specific students, I need diagnostic data to be able to understand exactly what spelling patterns do they know, exactly what is their point of need and instruction.
Well, thank you. I think we could spend much more time asking you and, learning from you, but I know you have a group of students about to come in. And so I'm going to hand it back over to Catherine.
Thank you so much, Margaret. That was really informative and inspiring to hear about your firsthand experience with your students. I only wish we had more time for participant questions. So thank you. And last on the agenda today, I would like to welcome another MRA colleague, Holly Banashevitz, to the mic to share about upcoming opportunities that may interest you to learn about the Mass Literacy Guide and evidence-based practices for early literacy.
Thank you, Catherine. We'd like to invite you to join MRA and DESE on December 1st for a session on the simple view of reading and evidence-based practices to support language comprehension and fluent word reading. Then on February 1st, we will explore literacy leadership and the MTSS model. Both sessions will feature Massachusetts educators speaking to their use of evidence-based practices. You can register via the links on the flyer, which is being dropped in the chat now. Also, to continue the learning, you can check out the new recommended reading section of the Mass Literacy Guide, which is noted on the slide. We look forward to seeing you and your colleagues at these upcoming events. Back to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Holly, and thanks to all of the MRA team that partnered with DESE to offer this webinar this afternoon. We sincerely hope you enjoyed today's webinar. If you have any further questions or comments, we would love to connect with you. You can reach the DESE Mass Literacy team through the Mass Literacy site, and you can connect with the Massachusetts Reading Association at massreading.org. Both of these links have been provided on the link sheet that you received in the chat. One last thing before you sign off, we would love to hear your feedback about today's webinar so that we can continually improve our offerings to you. Please take a moment to complete a brief survey. The survey link is coming to you in the chat, and it's also on the link sheet and will be sent to you tomorrow in a follow-up email. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining us and have a great evening.